Ma'am, are you sure you want to return the ticket? Tickets are hard to come by now, and you might not be able to book another, the ticket clerk said, his voice tinged with concern. I smiled politely, even as the chaos in my heart swirled like a storm. Yes, I'm sure. It doesn't matter how difficult it is to get another. I don't want it. What doesn't belong to me will always feel like a borrowed dream. The clerk hesitated for a moment before sliding the refund and receipt across the counter. All right. Here's your refund. Good luck. I nodded, took the receipt, and turned it over in my hands, the thin paper feeling as fragile as the life I had once tried to piece together. As I stood there, lost in thought, my fingers instinctively moved to the heart-shaped locket hanging from my neck. Opening it gently, I stared at the black and white photo inside. It was a picture of Daniel Lewis. A younger version of him, dressed in a crisp suit, his hair perfectly combed back. His eyes, deep-set and confident, seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. In that frozen moment, he was the epitome of charm and ambition. But to me, he was also the embodiment of heartbreak. Memories flooded my mind, each one sharp and vivid. I remembered a time when he had tenderly bandaged my sprained ankle, his shy eyes meeting mine with emotions too raw to name. And yet, years later, on our wedding night, those same eyes had looked at me with cold detachment. Emma, he had said, his voice devoid of warmth, I could never share a bed with a woman from the Bennett family. I hadn't understood then. I didn't understand why the boy who had once carried my photo close to his heart, who had promised me forever, would later tell me, even if you cry your eyes blind, I won't take you with me. He was leaving for France, and I was no longer part of his plans. At first, I blamed him. But over time, I turned that blame inward. Perhaps he was right. I was a sheltered, pampered daughter from a wealthy family, skilled only in embroidery and bound by outdated traditions. I had hoped to prove my worth to him, so I sold the embroidery studio my parents had left me and followed him to a distant land. But my efforts were met with indifference. He spent his days in the company of diplomats and high-ranking officials, while I remained an outsider, shut out of his world. I tried to adapt. I unbound my feet despite the pain, learned to dance, and embraced modern fashion. I thought these changes would make him see me in a new light. But when I finally attended one of his diplomatic receptions, I saw him holding another woman's waist as they danced, his eyes filled with a tenderness I hadn't seen in years. When someone asked about me, he replied casually, "She's my cousin." The woman was Olivia Carter, elegant, poised, and from a prominent family. She was everything I wasn't. The rumors whispered by his secretaries confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Olivia was his first love, and I was nothing more than a shadow in his life. One day, I gathered the courage to tell him I was pregnant. I hoped this news would change things. Perhaps he would finally see me as his wife, the mother of his child. Instead, he froze, the pen in his hand trembling before he said coldly, "Get an abortion." "It could kill me," I replied, my voice breaking. He sneered. "Plenty of people die in plane crashes. Does that mean they stop flying?" I was stunned into silence, clutching my stomach as tears streamed down my face. After a long pause, he added, "Your parents wrote to me. They miss you, Emma. Go back and take care of them for me." I returned to my family's home, raising my child alone while Daniel's world continued to shine brighter. When war broke out, I led my family through endless struggles, surviving by picking up embroidery again. My fingers bled from the needles, but I pressed on. One day, while flipping through a newspaper, I saw a photo of Daniel. He was standing tall and proud, Olivia Carter by his side. The caption read, "Diplomat Daniel Lewis and wife." Years later, when Olivia died in a bombing in Paris, Daniel returned briefly, his grief so profound that he looked like a man undone. Yet, even then, he gave me nothing but cold indifference. Not even a glance at the child who bore his name. When he fell gravely ill in his later years, I, now an old woman, took care of him until the very end. But even on his deathbed, the locket he clutched so tightly didn't hold my picture. It held hers. In that moment, I realized the depth of my futility. I had spent my entire life loving a man who never saw me, who never cared for me the way I had cared for him. He was my everything, and I was nothing to him. But now, things would be different. I folded the refunded ticket receipt and placed it in my locket, replacing Daniel's photo. This time, I would live for myself. As I returned to the house we had shared, I informed the housekeeper, the embroidery workshop is no longer for sale. Prepare a full embroidery setup for me. 7 years ago, a fire had taken my parents and crippled the Lewis family's 300-year-old embroidery legacy. But now, I had a plan. In my past life, a nobleman named Ryan Sterling had sought the finest craftsmanship for a custom suit. Back then, I had turned him down to follow Daniel overseas. This time, I wouldn't make the same mistake. If I could win Ryan Sterling's favor, it would be the turning point for the workshop. It was a chance to reclaim what had been lost. The sound of a car horn startled me. Looking up, I saw Daniel stepping out of a sleek black car. He was as handsome as ever, his sharp features radiating charm. Olivia Carter clung to his arm, her laughter ringing out like a melody. She was dressed in an exquisite lace dress, her cheeks flushed from wine. Daniel, I didn't get to dance enough at the gala. Won't you dance with me a little more, she teased, spinning into his arms. Their carefree happiness was a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my chest. As they stepped into the house, their laughter faded when they saw me. For a moment, we all stood frozen. Daniel, Olivia asked, breaking the silence, who is this? His expression darkened. She's my cousin, he said curtly. Before he could say more, I spoke up, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. I'm Emma. And I'm not here to stay silent anymore. Their shocked expressions were satisfying, but I knew this was only the beginning. This time, I would reclaim my life. And nothing, not Daniel, not Olivia, not the ghosts of my past, would stand in my way. Daniel's eyes narrowed, and his lips pressed into a thin line. Olivia's soft laughter from moments ago was replaced with a cautious silence as she studied me, her hand still looped through his arm. Emma, you seem different, Daniel finally said, his tone clipped, a wary edge in his voice. I met his gaze without flinching. Different? Perhaps. Or maybe I've just learned where I truly belong. His brows furrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Olivia's tinkling laugh broke the tension. Oh, Daniel, don't be so serious. Emma's clearly just joking. Right, Emma? I turned to her with a polite smile that didn't reach my eyes. No, Olivia, I'm not joking. And you're right, things are going to change around here. Her smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly masked it, leaning closer to Daniel. Darling, we should let her rest. It's been a long day for all of us. Darling. The word hung in the air like a slap. Once, I might have flinched at hearing her call him that, but not now. I'd had enough of being a spectator in my own life. I stepped aside and gestured toward the grand staircase. By all means, make yourselves comfortable. I have work to do. Daniel glanced at me again, his expression unreadable, but he said nothing as Olivia led him away. As their footsteps faded, I turned and walked to the study, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and resolve. The study was a sanctuary of memories, filled with the faint scent of aged wood and the whispers of a life that once seemed so promising. I ran my fingers along the edge of the desk, its surface smooth from years of use. A single photograph sat framed on the corner, a relic from better times. It showed Daniel and me on the day of our engagement. He was smiling, his arm loosely draped around my shoulders, but even then, there had been a distance in his eyes that I'd ignored. With a sharp intake of breath, I pushed the frame face down. I retrieved the locket around my neck and opened it, staring at the folded ticket receipt inside. It was a reminder of my promise to myself, to rebuild what had been lost and create a life that no longer revolved around Daniel Lewis. A knock at the door broke my thoughts. The housekeeper entered, her expression timid but kind. "Miss Emma, the embroidery setup is ready, just as you requested," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I smiled faintly. "Thank you. I'll be there shortly." As she turned to leave, I called out, "And Martha?" She paused, looking back at me expectantly. "No one is to disturb me while I'm working. Not Daniel, not Olivia. No one." Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Understood, Miss Emma." The workshop was tucked away in the west wing of the house, a room that had long been neglected. Dust motes danced in the air as I stepped inside, the faint scent of charred wood still lingering from the fire that had destroyed my family's legacy 7 years ago. But now, the room had been restored. Rows of vibrant threads and bolts of fabric lined the walls, and a sturdy embroidery frame stood in the center like a waiting sentinel. I lit a lantern and sat down, the weight of the day settling over me. My fingers hovered over the fabric stretched across the frame, and for a moment, I hesitated. Could I really do this? Could I bring the workshop back to life? Then I remembered Ryan Sterling, his sharp eyes, his discerning taste. In my past life, I had let that opportunity slip away, too consumed by my blind devotion to Daniel. But not this time. This time, I would show the world what the Bennett family's craftsmanship was capable of. With steady hands, I picked up a needle and began. The days passed in a blur of motion. I worked tirelessly, my fingers moving with a precision that felt almost instinctual. The phoenix design I had chosen was intricate and bold, a symbol of rebirth that mirrored my own journey. Each stitch was a declaration, each thread a step toward reclaiming my identity. But as focused as I was, the tension in the house was impossible to ignore. Olivia made a point of flaunting her relationship with Daniel, her laughter echoing through the halls like a taunt. And Daniel, he was an enigma. At times, I caught him watching me from a distance, his expression unreadable. Other times, he acted as if I didn't exist at all. On the 5th day, I decided to take a break from my work and visit the market to purchase additional supplies. The bustling streets were a welcome distraction, filled with the hum of life and the vibrant colors of fresh produce and textiles. I was examining a roll of silk when a familiar voice called out, "Emma?" I turned to see Daniel standing a few paces away, surrounded by a group of young men dressed in Western-style clothing. He looked as polished as ever, his sharp features accentuated by the tailored cut of his suit. For a moment, I felt the old pang of longing, but I quickly pushed it aside. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone neutral but laced with curiosity. "Buying supplies," I replied simply, holding up the silk. Olivia stepped forward then, her smile as radiant as ever. "Daniel, why don't we invite Emma to join us for a group photo? It'll be fun." Before I could decline, she grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a nearby photo studio. I resisted, but her grip was surprisingly firm. The studio was small but well lit, with a bright red backdrop that seemed almost garish. As Olivia positioned herself beside Daniel, I was struck by how perfectly they complemented each other. She was wearing a fitted black dress, her every movement exuding grace, while Daniel stood tall and composed, his hand resting lightly on her waist. "Just like a wedding photo," someone joked, and the others laughed. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. This moment, this perfect image of them together, wasn't meant for me. It never had been. "Emma," Olivia said, turning to me with a syrupy smile, "don't you think Daniel and I make the perfect pair?" Daniel's gaze flicked to me, a silent warning in his eyes. But I refused to give her the reaction she wanted. "You do," I said evenly, my voice devoid of emotion. "You're perfect for each other." Her smile widened, satisfied, while Daniel's expression darkened. The photographer snapped the picture, capturing the moment forever. And just like that, I had been relegated to the sidelines once again. But this time, I didn't linger. As soon as the photo session was over, I turned and left without a word. There was no point in staying where I wasn't wanted. That night, I worked even harder, my determination burning brighter than ever. The Phoenix design was coming to life, its vivid colors and intricate details a testament to my skill. I pricked my finger on the needle, but I didn't stop. The pain was a reminder of everything I had endured and everything I was fighting for. By dawn, the embroidery was nearly complete. I held it up to the light, marveling at the way the threads seemed to shimmer. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of pride. But as I carefully set the fabric aside, a noise from the hallway caught my attention. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. The door creaked open, and Daniel stepped inside, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something else I couldn't quite place. "You're still awake," he said, his voice low. I stood, wiping my hands on a cloth. "What do you want, Daniel?" He hesitated, his eyes scanning the room before settling on the embroidery frame. "You're working hard." "I have to," I replied, meeting his gaze. "Some of us don't have the luxury of coasting through life." His jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes lingering on the Phoenix design. "Why are you doing this?" he asked softly. "Because it's all I have left," I said simply. "And because I refuse to be forgotten." For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to say something more, but then he turned and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As the door closed behind him, I realized something. Daniel's presence no longer held the power it once did. I had found my strength, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. The Phoenix was rising, and so was I. The sixth day dawned quietly, with the pale light of the morning sun filtering through the embroidered curtains in my workshop. My Phoenix embroidery was finally complete, and I carefully folded the fabric, running my fingers over the vivid threads. It was more than a piece of art, it was a declaration of my resilience and the rebirth of my family's legacy. The thought gave me strength, but I knew this was only the first step. I placed the embroidery into a finely crafted wooden box, wrapping it in protective silk. Today was the day I would meet Ryan Sterling, the nobleman whose commission could change everything. My heart raced at the thought, not with fear but with determination. I had worked tirelessly for this moment, and I wouldn't let it slip through my fingers. The Sterling estate was an imposing sight, its towering iron gates opening to reveal a long driveway lined with ancient oak trees. As the carriage approached the grand mansion, I straightened my back and adjusted my simple but elegant attire. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, offering a reassuring smile. "Miss Emma, you'll do just fine," he said. I nodded, my resolve firm. "Thank you, Henry." As I stepped out of the carriage, a footman greeted me and led me inside. The interior of the mansion was as opulent as one would expect, with polished marble floors, gilded mirrors, and towering chandeliers. My footsteps echoed softly as I was guided to a sunlit drawing room where Ryan Sterling awaited. He rose as I entered, his tall frame clad in a tailored suit that spoke of understated elegance. His sharp features and piercing gaze were exactly as I remembered from our brief encounter in my past life. He extended a hand, and I shook it, meeting his eyes without wavering. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Thank you for coming. I've heard much about your family's craftsmanship." "Thank you for considering my work, Mr. Sterling," I replied, carefully setting the wooden box on the table between us. He gestured for me to sit and watched intently as I opened the box to reveal the Phoenix embroidery. His expression remained unreadable as he leaned forward to examine it, his fingers brushing lightly over the intricate threads. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he looked up, his eyes alight with genuine admiration. "This is remarkable," he said. "The detail, the colors, the way the design seems to come alive, it's unlike anything I've seen before." Relief and pride surged through me, but I kept my composure. "I'm honored that you think so. My family's legacy has always been rooted in preserving the art of embroidery. This piece is a reflection of that tradition." He nodded thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on the embroidery. "I'd like to commission a series of pieces from you, Miss Bennett. Each one inspired by a different cultural theme. Would you be interested?" My breath caught. This was more than I had hoped for. "I would be honored," I said, my voice steady despite the excitement bubbling within me. We spent the next hour discussing details, and by the time I left the Sterling estate, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This commission would not only revive the workshop but also re-establish the Bennett name as one of the finest in the world of embroidery. When I returned home, the house was unusually quiet. The faint sound of footsteps reached my ears as I climbed the stairs to the workshop, where I planned to begin sketching designs for the new commission. But as I reached the top of the staircase, I froze. The door to my workshop was ajar, and inside, I could see Olivia standing by the embroidery frame, her fingers grazing the delicate threads of the phoenix piece I had left behind. My chest tightened with fury. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping inside. Olivia turned, feigning innocence. "Oh, Emma, I was just admiring your work. It's truly beautiful." Her saccharine tone set my teeth on edge. "Don't touch anything," I said sharply. "This is not yours to handle." Her smile faltered, and a glint of irritation flashed in her eyes. "You don't have to be so defensive. I was only curious. After all, isn't it Daniel's family who funded this workshop? Doesn't that make it ours?" I stepped closer, my voice cold. "This workshop was rebuilt with my own hands and my own money. It has nothing to do with Daniel." Her expression darkened, but before she could retort, Daniel appeared in the doorway. His presence was commanding as always, but there was an edge to his gaze that made my heart race. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between us. "Nothing," I said, turning away. "I was just asking Olivia to leave." He raised an eyebrow, his tone laced with curiosity. "Why?" "She was only admiring your work." I clenched my fists. "Because this is my space, Daniel. My work. I don't need her interference." Olivia placed a hand on his arm, her voice dripping with sweetness. "Daniel, I didn't mean to upset her. I was only trying to help." He sighed, clearly exasperated. "Emma, there's no need to be so territorial. Olivia meant no harm." His dismissive tone was the final straw. I turned to face him, my voice steady but firm. "This isn't about being territorial, Daniel. It's about respect. Something neither of you seem to understand." His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Olivia, however, looked smug, as if she had won some unspoken battle. Without another word, I gathered the phoenix embroidery and walked out, leaving them behind. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. The commission from Ryan Sterling was a victory, but the constant tension with Daniel and Olivia was exhausting. I needed to find a way to rise above it, to focus on what truly mattered and let go of the things that didn't. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. I opened it to find Martha, the housekeeper, holding a letter. "Miss Emma, this arrived for you," she said, handing it over. I thanked her and closed the door, my curiosity piqued. The envelope was plain, but the handwriting on it was unmistakable. It was from Ryan Sterling. Breaking the seal, I unfolded the letter and read his words carefully. He had enclosed a list of themes for the embroidery series, along with a note of encouragement that warmed my heart. But what caught my attention most was his closing line, "Your phoenix is a masterpiece, Miss Bennet. I look forward to seeing how brightly it will soar." I smiled, clutching the letter to my chest. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not as someone's shadow or burden, but as an artist in my own right. The path ahead was still uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't let anyone dim my light again. The phoenix was rising, stronger and more determined than ever. And this time, there was no looking back. The house was unnervingly quiet in the days following my meeting with Ryan Sterling. Daniel and Olivia were preoccupied with their social gatherings, leaving me to work in peace. The embroidery workshop became my sanctuary, a place where the threads of my past and present wove together to create something entirely new. But the silence also carried a weight. Memories of my past life crept in like unwelcome guests, each one a reminder of the mistakes I had made and the opportunities one had let slip through my fingers. This time, I vowed, things would be different. One afternoon, as I was finalizing the sketches for the first embroidery piece in Ryan Sterling's series, the housekeeper entered with a hesitant knock. "Miss Emma, you have a visitor," she said, her tone unusually reserved. I frowned, setting aside my work. "A visitor? Did they give their name?" She shook her head. "No, but they're waiting in the drawing room." Curiosity piqued, I rose and made my way to the drawing room. As I entered, my breath caught. Seated on the velvet armchair was a man I hadn't seen in years, but whose presence was as familiar as the beat of my own heart. "Father," I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked up, his weathered face breaking into a tentative smile. "Emma. It's been a long time." We sat across from each other, the space between us filled with unspoken words. My father's once imposing frame seemed smaller now, his shoulders stooped with age. But his eyes, piercing and shrewd, hadn't changed. "You look well," he said, his voice warm but tinged with caution. "And you look tired," I replied, my gaze softening. "What brings you here?" He hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I heard about the fire, Emma. About how you've rebuilt the workshop. I wanted to see it for myself." My chest tightened. The fire had taken so much from us, our home, our legacy, and nearly our lives. It was a wound that had never fully healed, and his acknowledgement of it stirred emotions I thought I had buried. "It's not the same as it was," I admitted, "but I'm trying to make something of it again." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Your mother would be proud." The mention of her name hit me like a blow, and I had to look away to compose myself. "Father," I said finally, "there's something I need to ask you." He raised an eyebrow, waiting. "Why did you push for my marriage to Daniel? You knew he didn't love me. You knew I would never truly belong in his world." The question hung in the air, heavy with years of resentment and confusion. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, with a weary sigh, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I thought I was protecting you," he said quietly. "After the fire, the Bennett name was in ruins. Your mother, she wanted you to have a secure future. Daniel's family offered that security. I didn't realize the cost would be your happiness." His words were like a balm and a blade, soothing some wounds while cutting open others. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't. The weight of his regret was evident, and it mirrored my own. "I've found my own path now," I said softly. "I don't need Daniel or his family to define my worth. The workshop, it's my way of honoring our family's legacy." His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he reached across the table to take my hand. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, Emma. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." After my father left, I returned to the workshop, my mind racing with a mix of emotions. His visit had stirred memories I had tried to suppress, but it had also reminded me of my purpose. The workshop wasn't just about reclaiming a legacy, it was about forging a future that was entirely my own. That evening, as I worked late into the night, a soft knock at the door startled me. Expecting the housekeeper, I called out without looking up. "Come in." The door creaked open, and I heard the unmistakable sound of Daniel's measured footsteps. My hands froze mid-stitch, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I wanted to talk." I sighed, setting aside the embroidery frame. "About what?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the phoenix embroidery on the table. "You've been working hard on this," he said, his voice softer than I expected. "It's important to me," I replied. "More important than anything else right now." He nodded, his jaw tightening. I've been thinking about what you said. About respect. You were right." His admission caught me off guard, and I studied him carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity. But his expression was earnest, his eyes steady as they met mine. "I've taken you for granted, Emma," he continued. "And I've let Olivia," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I've let her push you aside. That wasn't fair." I crossed my arms, unwilling to let him off so easily. "And what do you intend to do about it?" He looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know yet. But I want to make things right." A bitter laugh escaped me. "You think you can fix this with words, Daniel? After everything?" His eyes snapped back to mine, and for a moment, I saw a flash of something raw and vulnerable. "I'm trying, Emma. I don't know how to undo the past, but I want to try." For a long moment, we stared at each other, the weight of our shared history hanging heavy in the air. Finally, I sighed, the fight leaving me. "You can start by respecting my boundaries," I said quietly. "And by understanding that my life doesn't revolve around you anymore." He nodded slowly. "I can do that." Without another word, he turned and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, change was possible. But I also knew that I couldn't rely on Daniel for my happiness. That was something I had to create for myself. The following morning, I received a letter from Ryan Sterling inviting me to a formal dinner at his estate. The event was to celebrate the start of our collaboration, and it was an opportunity to present my work to some of the most influential figures in the industry. Excitement and nerves warred within me as I read the elegant script. This dinner was more than just a social gathering. It was a chance to prove myself, to step out of the shadows of my past and into the light of my own making. I carefully folded the letter and set it aside, my resolve firm. The phoenix was ready to soar, and nothing would hold it back. The evening of Ryan Sterling's dinner arrived with a crisp chill in the air, the kind that made every breath feel sharper and every step more deliberate. I stood before the mirror in my room, smoothing the fabric of the midnight blue gown I had chosen for the occasion. It was simple yet elegant, with intricate embroidery along the hem, my own handiwork, of course. The phoenix motif glimmered subtly in silver thread, a quiet testament to the journey that had brought me here. Martha, the housekeeper, entered carrying a velvet box. "Miss Emma, this arrived for you earlier today. It's from Mr. Sterling." Curious, I opened the box to find a delicate necklace inside, a single sapphire pendant set in a swirl of silver. A note accompanied it. "Miss Bennett, this piece reminded me of your work, bold, timeless, and uniquely you. I hope you will wear it tonight. Ryan Sterling ***, a small smile tugged at my lips. The gesture was thoughtful, and I fastened the necklace around my neck. The sapphire sparkled in the soft light, catching the threads of silver in my gown. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt truly seen. The Sterling estate was alive with activity when I arrived. Lanterns lined the winding driveway, their golden glow illuminating the grand facade of the mansion. Footmen stood at the entrance, welcoming guests as carriages arrived one after another. Inside, the air buzzed with conversation and the soft strains of a string quartet. As I stepped into the main hall, heads turned. The gown, the necklace, the confidence in my posture, everything seemed to draw attention. For once, I didn't shrink from it. Let them look, I thought. Tonight, I wasn't just an observer. I was here to claim my place. Ryan spotted me almost immediately. He excused himself from a conversation and approached, his smile warm and genuine. "Miss Bennet," he said, offering his hand. "You look stunning." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I replied, taking his hand briefly. "And thank you for the necklace. It's beautiful." "It suits you," he said simply, then gestured toward the gathering. "Come, there are people I'd like you to meet." The evening unfolded like a dream. Ryan introduced me to diplomats, patrons of the arts, and influential figures from every corner of society. Each time he spoke of my work, his words were laced with genuine admiration, and I found myself growing more comfortable with each interaction. The phoenix embroidery had been displayed in the main salon, drawing praise from nearly everyone who saw it. "Your work is extraordinary, Miss Bennet," one patron said, her eyes lingering on the intricate details of the piece. "I've never seen anything like it." "Thank you," I said, bowing my head slightly. "It's an honor to share my family's legacy with the world." The evening felt like a triumph, but as the hours wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I would catch a fleeting glimpse of Daniel in the crowd, his sharp gaze following me. He had arrived with Olivia, of course, and while she was busy charming the other guests, he seemed more interested in observing me. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the opportunities before me. But when I stepped out onto the balcony for a moment of quiet, he followed. "You've certainly made an impression tonight," Daniel said, his voice low as he stepped into the cool night air. I turned to face him, keeping my expression neutral. Was that meant to be a compliment? His lips twitched, but he didn't smile. "You've changed, Emma. I hardly recognize you." "Perhaps that's because you never really knew me," I replied, my voice steady. He flinched, the faintest crack in his composed demeanor. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I said, folding my arms. "You've spent years ignoring me, dismissing me, and now that I've built something of my own, you suddenly take notice. Why is that, Daniel?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I don't know. Maybe I was wrong about you." The admission hung in the air, unexpected and almost unsettling. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. But then I realized it didn't matter. His opinion of me no longer held the weight it once did. "It's too late for that," I said quietly. "I don't need your validation, Daniel. Not anymore." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "And what about us? Is there no chance to?" I shook my head, cutting him off. "There is no us, Daniel. There never really was. You made that clear a long time ago." His shoulders sagged slightly, but he nodded. "I see." Without another word, he turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone on the balcony. The tension that had weighed on me for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of closure. When I returned to the main hall, Ryan was waiting for me. His eyes searched mine, and he must have sensed the shift in my mood. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone gentle. I smiled, the first genuine smile I had felt all evening. "Yes. Everything is finally as it should be." He offered his arm, and I took it, allowing him to lead me back into the light and warmth of the gathering. For the first time, I felt truly free, free of the past, free of the pain, and free to embrace the future that lay ahead. The phoenix had risen, and its wings were stronger than ever. The days after the Sterling dinner passed in a blur of activity and new beginnings. Ryan's commission had opened doors I never imagined, and orders for my work began pouring in from influential clients across the country. The Phoenix embroidery had become a symbol of resilience and artistry, and with each new creation, I felt my confidence grow. But with success came challenges. Balancing the demands of the workshop with the lingering tensions in the house tested my resolve daily. Daniel and Olivia's presence was a constant reminder of the life I had left behind, a life I was determined never to return to. One morning, as I was reviewing sketches for a new piece, Martha appeared at the door with an anxious expression. "Miss Emma, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Frowning, I set aside the sketches and followed her to the drawing room. Standing by the window was a man I didn't recognize at first glance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a soldier's uniform, his face weathered by years of service. When he turned to face me, my breath caught. "Henry?" I whispered, disbelief lacing my voice. He smiled, a ghost of the boy I once knew shining through the hardened features of the man before me. "It's been a long time, Emma." Henry was the son of our former coachman, a childhood friend who had vanished from my life years ago when he left to join the military. Seeing him now, after all this time, stirred a mix of emotions, nostalgia, relief, and an unspoken ache for the innocence we had both lost. "What are you doing here?" I asked, stepping closer. His smile faded, replaced by a somber expression. I heard about everything that's happened. The fire, the workshop, your marriage." He hesitated, as if unsure how much to say. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." I felt a lump form in my throat at his concern. "I'm fine, Henry. Better than fine, actually. The workshop is thriving, and I've found my own path." His gaze softened, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "And Daniel? Is he treating you well?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. I met his eyes, unflinching. "Daniel and I have nothing to do with each other anymore. My life doesn't revolve around him." Relief washed over Henry's face, though he quickly masked it. "Good. You deserve better, Emma. You always have." Henry's visit brought back memories of simpler times, but it also reminded me of how far I had come. We spent the afternoon catching up, reminiscing about our childhood and sharing stories of the paths our lives had taken. He spoke of his experiences in the military, the battles he had fought, and the comrades he had lost. His stories were laced with a quiet strength, and I couldn't help but admire the man he had become. When he finally rose to leave, he turned to me with a determined expression. "If you ever need anything, Emma, you know where to find me. I'll always be here for you." "Thank you, Henry," I said softly. "That means more than you know." As the weeks passed, the workshop's reputation continued to grow. Each completed commission brought new challenges and new opportunities, and I threw myself into the work with renewed vigor. But amid the successes, there was one task that weighed heavily on my mind, the final piece in Ryan Sterling's series. The theme for the last piece was rebirth, a fitting conclusion to the collection. I knew it had to be more than just beautiful, it had to capture the essence of everything I had endured and overcome. Late one night, as I sat before the embroidery frame, the design finally came to me. The centerpiece would be a phoenix rising from a bed of ashes, its wings outstretched in triumph. Surrounding it would be delicate floral patterns, each bloom representing a different stage of growth and renewal. The vision was clear, but bringing it to life would be the most challenging work I had ever undertaken. As I worked tirelessly on the piece, the house seemed to grow quieter. Daniel and Olivia's outings became more frequent, and their absence was a welcome relief. But one evening, as I was putting the finishing touches on the phoenix's wings, I heard raised voices from the parlor. Curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly made my way to the door. Pressing my ear against it, I recognized Olivia's sharp tone. "You're obsessed with her, Daniel. Don't deny it. I see the way you look at her, the way you follow her around like a shadow." Daniel's voice was lower but no less intense. "This isn't about Emma. This is about you, Olivia. You've done nothing but stir trouble since the day you arrived." There was a crash, as if something fragile had been thrown against the wall. "You're lying," Olivia screamed. "You've never cared about me, have you?" It's always been her. The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, waiting for Daniel's response, but none came. Instead, I heard the sound of footsteps storming out of the room and the front door slamming shut. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Olivia's words echoed in my mind, but I pushed them aside. Whatever feelings Daniel might have had, or still had, were irrelevant. My life was no longer tied to his, and I wouldn't let his turmoil derail my progress. The final piece in Ryan Sterling's collection was completed on a crisp autumn morning. As I stood back to admire it, a wave of emotion washed over me. The phoenix seemed to leap from the fabric, its vibrant colors and intricate details a testament to the journey I had undertaken. It wasn't just a piece of art, it was a symbol of my rebirth, a declaration of my resilience. When Ryan came to collect it, his reaction was everything I had hoped for. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've outdone yourself. This is magnificent." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I said, my heart swelling with pride. "It's an honor to have been part of this project." As he left, I felt a sense of closure. The phoenix had risen, and so had I. My past no longer held me captive, and the future stretched before me like an open road, filled with endless possibilities. The weeks following the completion of Ryan Sterling's series felt like the culmination of a long and arduous journey. With each passing day, the workshop thrived, its reputation growing far beyond what I had ever dared to hope for. My phoenix embroidery, the crown jewel of the collection, became a symbol of artistry and perseverance, inspiring admiration and respect from patrons and artisans alike. But even as success enveloped me, a quiet yearning lingered. It wasn't for love or validation, I had learned to find those within myself, but for something deeper, a sense of true fulfillment, untethered from the shadows of my past. One crisp morning, as the sunlight streamed through the windows of the workshop, a letter arrived. The envelope bore an unfamiliar seal, and as I opened it, my heart quickened with anticipation. "Dear Miss Bennett, it is with great pleasure that we invite you to participate in the International Artisans Exhibition in Paris. Your recent work has captured the attention of our panel, and we believe your unique artistry will be a valuable addition to this year's event. We eagerly await your response. Sincerely, the exhibition committee ****. My breath caught as I read the words again, hardly daring to believe them. Paris. The city that had once seemed like the end of a dream now represented a new beginning. The preparations for the exhibition consumed my days and nights. The invitation was both an honor and a challenge, and I poured every ounce of my creativity and energy into crafting pieces that would stand out on the world stage. The Phoenix design became the foundation for the collection, its themes of rebirth and resilience woven into every stitch. But even as I focused on my work, the lingering presence of Daniel and Olivia cast a shadow over the house. Their arguments grew more frequent, and their once public displays of affection had withered into cold indifference. One evening, as I returned from a late meeting in town, I found Daniel waiting in the study. He sat in the dim light, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his usually composed demeanor replaced by a quiet vulnerability. "Emma," he said as I entered, his voice heavy. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, then nodded, taking a seat across from him. What is it, Daniel? He stared into his glass for a moment before speaking. Olivia's leaving. She's decided to move back to her family's estate. She says there's nothing left for her here. I studied his face, searching for any trace of regret or sorrow, but all I saw was weariness. And what about you? I asked. What do you want, Daniel? He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. I don't know anymore. I thought I had everything figured out, but it's all come undone. His words stirred a flicker of sympathy within me, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't afford to be drawn back into his orbit. Daniel, I said gently but firmly, you've spent your life chasing what you thought you were supposed to want. Maybe it's time to figure out what truly matters to you. He nodded slowly, the weight of my words sinking in. And you? What matters to you, Emma? I smiled, a quiet confidence filling me. My work. My future. And the freedom to build a life on my own terms. For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to say more, but he simply nodded, raising his glass in a silent toast. The day of my departure for Paris arrived with a mix of excitement and nerves. The workshop was bustling as Martha and the other staff helped pack the final pieces for the exhibition. Ryan Sterling arrived to see me off, his presence a steady source of encouragement. You're going to be brilliant, he said, his warm smile easing my nerves. Paris won't know what hit it. I laughed softly, grateful for his unwavering support. Thank you, Ryan. For everything. As the carriage pulled away from the house, I looked back one last time. Daniel stood at the entrance, watching me leave. He raised a hand in a gesture of farewell, and I returned it, the moment feeling like the final page of a long and bittersweet chapter. Paris was everything I had imagined and more. The city buzzed with energy, its streets alive with art, music, and culture. The exhibition venue, a grand hall adorned with intricate architecture, was filled with works from artisans around the world. Standing among them, I felt a sense of belonging I had never known before. The opening night was a resounding success. Patrons and critics alike marveled at the Phoenix collection, their praise reaffirming the choices I had made and the path I had taken. As I stood before the centerpiece, the Phoenix rising from ashes, I felt a deep sense of pride and peace. This was my triumph, my rebirth. Months later, as I walked along the Seine, the autumn leaves falling gently around me, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I had faced loss, betrayal, and heartache, but I had emerged stronger, with a clear sense of who I was and what I wanted. A familiar voice called out, and I turned to see Ryan approaching, a warm smile on his face. He fell into step beside me, and together we walked, the future stretching out before us like an open canvas. The phoenix had risen, and with it, so had I. The horizon was endless, and for the first time, I was free to soar.